In the modern gaming landscape, games are too long more than they are too short. Sandbox titles and games as service releases are incredibly popular, and as a result, it's the norm for the average blockbuster to be anywhere from 20 to 30 to 200 hours long. Where the argument once was, is this worth $60? It's now, is all this content just quantity over quality? That said, there have still been plenty of titles, both past and present, that have come out feeling a little bit undercooked. These titles might not be bad, and quality isn't purely measured in length, it's just that you come out the other end wishing there was more, and with a nagging suspicion that they climax too early. Not that I know anything about that. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video games that were too damn short. Number 10, The BOURNE Conspiracy. Now this is a bit of a weird one. Believe it or not, I bloody love The BOURNE Conspiracy, a game a bunch of people watching this probably didn't even know existed. It was a flawed, if ambitious adaptation, but its biggest crime is that it was over in just 6 hours, and cuts to black just as things start getting really good. An underrated gem from High Moon Studios, who know a thing or two about crafting great games, the licensed tie-in blended solid third-person shooting with intense hand-to-hand combat seamlessly, bringing to life the grit of Robert Ludlum's world. Sadly, poor sales and a middling critical reception meant a sequel would never materialize, which is a huge shame, because Conspiracy cemented a solid base for a franchise going forward. And who knows, maybe if Matt Damon lent his likeness to the main character, it might have gained a bigger audience. That's right, I'm blaming Matt Damon for this underperforming, and you should too. Number 9, Homefront. The Homefront series always deserved better games. Both the original and the sequel, which was crafted by a team of new developers, failed to fulfill the potential of the premise, which chronicled the Korean invasion of the US. Both games are still enjoyable in their own right, but it's the original we need to talk about today. Essentially, like most other modern military shooters from the early 2010s, Homefront played out like a Call of Duty clone, but with the backgrounds and enemies swapped out. It was on rails and scripted to a fault, but there were a bunch of inspired set pieces in there and enough excitement to carry the player through. However, establishing a new world order and how a force like a unified Korea could invade the US and occupy it takes a lot of time to be believable, as does establishing the player's own place in this environment, and time isn't what Homefront's campaign had. At only 4 hours long, the story buckled under its own weight, and while the climactic firefight was bold and exciting, it felt more like the midpoint of a story rather than the resolution. Number 8, The Darkness 2. The Darkness was not only one of the best bands of the early 2000s, but was also one of those underrated shooters from the same era that nobody played because the whole world was too enraptured by Call of Duty and Halo to care about anything that fell in between. Still, it gained a strong cult following and managed to nab itself a sequel, which launched 5 years after the original. Picking up the story of Jackie, a man imbued with the supernatural powers of the titular darkness, who's now become something of a mob boss, the player spends the bulk of the game taking out other criminals and attempting to save the soul of his murdered girlfriend Jenny. Unlike the predecessor though, which spun its story out over 10 hours, the sequel crams everything into a measly 6. The experience was still solid, but after a 5-year wait, the short campaign left a lot to be desired. Number 7, Blair Witch. Like a lot of Bloober Team games, 2019's Blair Witch has some great ideas that are sadly weakened by clumsy execution. There is a great story at the heart of the release, about a troubled former military man venturing into the Burkittsville woods to look for a lost child, as well as some flourishes in how it's presented, but ultimately the experience doesn't come together as a cohesive whole. The disparate elements all work, but the way the story is told feels way too rushed. The main antagonist, Carver, goes from being a shady, mysterious figure in the shadows to just being there, talking to you and explaining his motives in the space of a single level, while the climax comes out of nowhere to wrap everything up only a few levels after some of the biggest plot points are actually introduced. The tie-in would have benefited from either being 2 hours long or 8 hours long, but instead it lies somewhere in the middle of no man's land, too short to deliver on all of its ideas, but too long to be considered a cool little experiment. Number 6, Man of Medan. Though it's not a true sequel, the Dark Pictures anthology is the spiritual successor to Until Dawn that horror fans have been waiting for. While developers Supermassive Games have experimented with other genres and VR, Man of Medan is a real return to form for the studio, and a great case for them being one of the best voices in this kind of interactive storytelling. That said, the game definitely feels like the first stab at something bigger. At around 4 hours, this release was always going to be on the shorter end of proceedings. After all, it's only the first part in a larger anthology. But the problem is that the game is actually too ambitious for its own good. The awkward length, similar to Blair Witch in that it's too short to feel like a proper game, but too long to focus on a few core areas and embrace being an experimental short, means that plot points are underdeveloped, the villains don't completely come into focus, and some elements feel a little bit too contrived. Number 5. The Order 1886. The Order 1886 isn't an amazing game, but it did have so much potential. The strange period setting mixed real-world history with fantasy as the player controlled a member of a secret organization created to battle against supernatural forces. The graphically impressive title boasted a great concept, and the stellar cinematic werewolf battles that took the focus in pre-release trailers were genuinely stunning and promised a true next-gen experience. Of course, then it came out, and one sentiment dominated the headlines: it was too damn short. Early reviews made it clear that the game was more of a tech demo for the PS4 rather than a fully fleshed out title, and once players got their own hands on the shooter, it became clear that was essentially true. The Order clocks in at about 5 hours long, with entire chapters sometimes amounting to nothing more than a cutscene and long drawn out walking sequences padding out the so-called gameplay. The brevity is an issue, but the main problem is that the game's plot is actually compelling in the later chapters once all that setup is out the way, but then it just stops. Number 4. Star Wars The Force Unleashed 2. We took Star Wars The Force Unleashed for granted. The 2000s were something of a double-edged lightsaber when it came to games based in this universe. Unlike now, there was no shortage of them hitting shelves on a regular basis, but that also meant the quality was hit and miss depending on which series you were playing. Still, the original Force Unleashed was a promising start, spinning an interesting tale about Darth Vader's secret apprentice and doubling down, as the title suggests, on Force powers as much as lightsaber combat. It had its flaws, but it was difficult to care about them because force-choking stormtroopers and throwing them into the void over and over and over again was just so much fun. There was hope then that the sequel would round out its rougher edges, but sadly the next game didn't feel like the revolution it should have been. Though it was still a fun time, and the combat mechanics were even more enjoyable to experiment with, it felt like even more corners had been cut. That translated over to the length as well, and at only 6 hours long, the game felt more like a big expansion pack than a true sequel. Number 3. Aliens vs Predator. Neither the Alien or Predator franchises have enjoyed much success in the world of video games. The less said about Ash Millman's favourite game ever, Colonial Marines, the better. But the mashups starring both monsters have been among the better efforts. 2010's soft reboot Aliens vs Predator was no exception, giving players control of the two title characters as well as regular Marines across 3 stellar campaigns and an even better multiplayer suite. The Marines campaign was the most robust, taking cues from James Cameron's Aliens and delivering some surprisingly tense survival horror sequences, while the Aliens segment had you playing the entire life cycle of a xenomorph, and the Predator's levels delved into the power fantasy and freedom associated with the terrifying being. It was all quality content, but each campaign varied in length. The Aliens campaign was the more stilted, a bare-bones hour-and-a-half affair, and this skimping left each story feeling a little short-changed and made players wonder if one robust campaign might have been better. Number 2. Gears of War 4. Now, Gears of War 4 is admittedly a funny entry on this list, because taken in isolation it probably won't appear all that short. The campaign clocks in at a meaty 9 hours, which is only a touch under the other entries in the franchise, but it's mostly the pacing that kills the sequel dead. And that's partly because Microsoft had a pretty difficult task on its hands when it came to crafting Gears 4. Not only had the original developers left to work on other projects, but the new team was picking up a series that had pretty definitively tied off its story. Consequently, the entire sequel bends over backwards to give itself a reason to exist, establishing new characters, reintroducing old ones, and putting in the groundwork so that players could view the continuation as a vital part of the story as opposed to just a cash-in. In that sense, the game works, but it also results in the whole thing feeling very much like the first act of a larger story. The stakes are small scale, the characters only feel truly fleshed out towards the end, and the magic similarly only returns in those closing sequences. In a way, it kind of feels like a 9-hour prologue to the proper Gears 4, which I guess is Gears 5. Number 1, Deus Ex Mankind Divided. Deus Ex Mankind Divided is such a frustrating game to play. Like its predecessor, the sheer freedom the player has at their disposal is nothing short of astonishing, and the ways you can experiment with the robust systems at hand make for a deeply personalized experience. However, while the title is mechanically robust, the story is strangely half-baked, and ends abruptly on an unsatisfying cliffhanger. There is apparently a reason for this though. There were reports around the game's release that the project was growing too ambitious for Square Enix liking, and that in order to get a Deus Ex game out regularly, they decided to effectively split Mankind Divided into 2 parts. The first is the game we got, and the second was set to drop a couple years later. That could have been fine, but the issue is that the follow-up has now effectively been cancelled. Mankind Divided underperformed, and the devs were moved on to Tomb Raider and now a Marvel superhero game, with fans of Deus Ex being left with what essentially amounts to half of a game. So that's our list. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Do you also agree that these games were too short, and would you either prefer a follow-up or just more of the same from any of them? Either way, while you're down there, could you give us a like, share, subscribe, and head over to WhatCulture.com for more lists and news like this every single day. Even if you don't know, I've been Josh, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.